that we don't have to read them through the lens of any one particular event or through any one person's particular experience. We can pick up the Psalms and take someone else's ancient prayer and put it on our lips and make it our own. And it certainly seems that this is the way not only the latter part of the Old Testament, what we call Second Temple Judaism, and the earliest Christians, including Jesus. It seems that that kind of generic adaptation of a Spirit-inspired prayer or a Spirit-inspired song and taking those ancient words and making them our words is exactly how Jesus and the early Jewish believers of his day employed the Psalms. And of course, throughout the church's life, as we've even seen in praying the daily office together today, we do the same kind of thing. And what that leads us to is a really neat kind of thing that if you read through the Psalms, they're wonderfully dynamic. I mean, there are Psalms that are just effusive with praise, lost in wonder, sort of schnockered by the glory of God. They come with that exuberant language of praise. And then you'll flip the page and you go to the next hymn, and it's, cranky anger complaining. And even there are some psalms, and we'll deal with some of those next week, where they're vindictive and nasty and even violent. One psalm says, is praying a prayer asking God to avenge the people of God. And the psalmist seems to be talking about the Babylonians when the Israelites were in captivity, and says, "Blessed is the one who will take your children and smash their head onto rocks." And you sort of get this violent imagery that you really think that you can express yourself with that kind of anger and that kind of lust for vengeance before God. And they did. And now what we're supposed to do with that as Christians is a conversation that we need to have. But it says something that the rapture of praise and then the bitterness of violent anger can both exist kind of side by side in this book. And then within that continuum, there are all sets of other emotions. So chances are that if you get through all 150 Psalms, you will probably be able to identify with the sentiments and with the longings, with the sorrows, with the joys, with the praise, with complaint. You'll find something to identify with just about every possible position a human being can find themselves in. And because of that, the Psalms end up being wonderful training in how to be a fully human being, laden with all of your emotions, with all of your resentments, with your angers, with your desires, with your aversions, with your hopes for the future, with your anxiety about death, your experience of adversity in circumstances, your experience of the attacks and conflict that enemies bring into your life. None of that is alien to God. And so when you take those psalms on your lips and make those prayers your prayers, it trains us in how to be a human, fully alive and fully in touch with our emotions, before God. And it's when we are open to God like that and kind of transparent before him, then God has something to work with, right? He can begin redeeming our vengeances and our violence. He can be exalted and thrilled, and we have new ways to express praise to God, new vocabulary to use. We have friends in foxholes when we're being oppressed and attacked by enemies, we know that we're not the first people to ever be here. But then we also have the assurance that God is just and God is loving, God is forgiving. When we are lost in our own sins, when we're in those positions in life where we've hurt somebody deeply, and maybe so deeply that we're afraid to even name the hidden little pockets of wickedness and evil in ourselves, the Psalms give us ways to express that and help us in some ways to examine our conscience, because they are in touch with the dynamism of those kinds of experiences, and give us the way to confess our sins and indeed to receive an assurance that God really can forgive us even of that. So that's a little bit of an overture into sort of some explanations. Let's look at. Well, let me just pause right there and just sort of ask you: does that evoke any questions or any thoughts or any responses so far? As if sort of feel like maybe. Go ahead.
When you said at some point the canon was, somebody said, let's hold it here.
Mm-hmm.
Was this some point in Jewish history?
Yeah, the answer is kind of yes and kind of no, which is so. Let me get you. You want a yes or no? No, it's a maybe. One of the things that's really tough about whenever you start thinking about the limits of the canon of Scripture, you end up dealing with the muddiness of Judaism. There really isn't a one Judaism. There are lots of Judaisms by the time of the days of Jesus. And it was at one time pretty common for Christian scholars to point back to an event called the Council of Yavna, or Jamnia is the way it gets translated in some books. And it was almost, the imagination is that, all the rabbis kind of got together and said, okay, this is it. and it doesn't seem to, the appeal to Yavna, or to the Council of Jamnia, has in more recent years come under some real criticism as a kind of invented thing that really you don't have a moment where somebody just said, okay. What you have is a gradual evolution and adaptation, and then as a community begins to use these things on a regular basis, and that community connects with other communities that use the collection, gradually it evolves to a kind of fixity. And in Judaism, it seems to have achieved a kind of fixity before Jesus. But then when Jesus shows up, the early Christian movement starts to add a New Testament to an Old Testament. And then what happens is the question again gets opened to what we're going to hang on to from, are we going to hang on to the Old Testament, or are we not going to hang on to the Old Testament? And that took place in a big conversation with a particular heretic named Marcion. And Marcion said, we want to just get rid of the Old Testament because it's a revelation of a very violent, substandard God. And so let's stay with the Gospels and with a few books from Paul. And the church said, no, we're not going to cut ourselves off from the entirety of the history of the people of God. And so beginning first with a Greek version of the Old Testament known as the Septuagint, they pulled those writings and brought them into a canon with what was, for the first 3 centuries of the church, a kind of gelled up and fixation of the New Testament. And so then you have more or less the kind of canon that we have today. Except that one of the things that happens is that the Hebrew Bible continues to evolve a little bit. So there are at times differences between that Greek Bible that the early Christians seem to use and the what we call the Masoretic text of the Old Testament that's written in Hebrew. And there are various points. There are never really big differences, but they are at times pretty significant. So what I want to say is that you have what began as a utter chaos and different books being written and songs developing here and there in different places, achieved a kind of basic cohesion before Jesus.
Okay.
So that Jesus and the disciples are using a psalter that looks more or less like ours, but there is actually a little bit of evolution even beyond Jesus and the apostles that continues up until the early Middle Ages. So at the end of the day, what you want to say is there's you move from lots of dynamism to less dynamism to then a kind of fixity where the canon is considered closed, and that happens for Christians in about the 4th century AD, right around the same time that we were figuring out the doctrine of the Trinity, and about the same time that we were figuring out whether our church should be governed by deacons, priests, and bishops, or should we also include prophets and evangelists and pastors and other things that have that seem to be roles that may have been ordained or not in the earliest days of the church, stopped being that, and so we have a bishop, priest, and a deacon. And so we get the creed, we get the canon, we get the clergy, and then also the regular shape of our liturgy. So the way Christians approach Eucharistic worship and the Mass all seems to kind of pull together right around the 4th century, when Christianity goes from being radically persecuted and marginalized to being recognized as the religion of the Roman Empire. Probably more information than you wanted to know, but that's the tough thing about canon. You start to talk and you say, how do I approach this without saying everything? But that's the long kind of history for this. But I think what most of us end up with was Jesus dealing with the Bible much like ours, and at least as far as the Old Testament is concerned, the answer is pretty much. And then obviously the New Testament kind of gets added after Jesus, but we've sort of retained something of that basic shape of the Scriptures. Others? All right. Well, okay. I'm gonna keep going here for a few minutes. One of the things that you'll see in the Psalms are titles. Does everybody bring a Bible? Yeah, if not, I've got a couple extra copies here. Jude? Yeah. Turn to that. I think most of us know Psalm 51 pretty well. So let's go to Psalm 51, because it'll be one of those ones that's fairly familiar to all of us, and that'll be a basis of comparison. We'll look at some other Psalms along the way here in a few minutes.
So,
Go ahead.
You said that, David wrote most of them.
Well, we'll get to this. Not necessarily. Most of them are attributed to David, or at least many Psalms are attributed to David. But the question of what La David means is something of an open question. And we also know a little bit that the titles that describe authorship are later than the Psalm itself.
Yeah.
So the answer is yes, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
answer it later.
All right. So let's look. One of the